Huh? Okay. Good morning, dear colleagues and dear students. It's a great pleasure for us at Now University, our friends and big scientist Tom Bracebridge represent the Science Council for Global Initiatives. He's the president. And also big specialist, it's nuclear energetic and nuclear technologies. And also I think the people which are thinking about future, thinking about sustainable development strategy, the role of the nuclear technologies in the world. And in this case, if we are talking about nuclear technologies, about our future of the institute, future of your personal career, if I'm talking about students, and future about Russia, like a part of a big system for the nuclear education and nuclear science. In this case, Tom, if you don't mind, I give it possibility to present your presentation, and also Tom, a small present for you, the book, an electronic version in this case. If you will have the question after the lectures, you can find it in his book. Okay.
You want me to?
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I've had the opportunity to come here and speak to you before, so some of you may have heard some of this. Bear with me. Before I get started, though, I'd like to ask you a question about climate change, because there are a lot of scientists that I deal with both in Russia and in the United States and in other countries, and many of them are older. They're in their 70s, even 80s, and when I talk to them about climate change, they don't believe that it's a problem. And you know, I have children of my own. They're in their 30s. I talk to a lot of people that are a generation younger than me, and it seems like all the young people understand that climate change is a really big problem and that we have to deal with it. And nuclear power is clearly one of the best ways, if not the way, to do it. So can any of you tell me, like, what's the general feeling about climate change here, say at the university here? I'd just like to hear from one of you or two of you about, you know, how climate change is perceived, because I think it's going to have a really big impact on your future, on your careers, if climate change politics is forcing people to think about using nuclear power. Can anybody enlighten me about, you know, kind of the general idea about climate change among the students here? Anybody? Come on, speak up. Okay, yes. Microphone.
Please use microphone. It will be more useful.
So I mean the climate change, basically we can see this in the change or the increasing in the temperature. So as we can see here, we're in Russia and it's May and the temperature is increasing.
Yeah.
And I live in Jordan, also the temperature is so
it's hot.
yeah, it's hot. So I mean this is the main problem with the climate change. On the other hand, also the ozone layer, also it's affected by the climate change. So I think it's the main problem we should we are facing here in the world. And I think using the nuclear power plant or maybe also the renewable energy, it's gonna be the solution of this main problem.
Yeah.
So I think this is the main idea that I have.
So
Yeah.
generally, among that's probably the general feeling among
Yeah.
the students here. Yeah. You were also going to say something.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Mujin Nakachukudi from Nigeria. Now, I want to give a little bit feel of Nigeria. We have the problem of losing forest, deforestation, desertification. And in the southern part of Nigeria, there is increase in flood as a result of we know, climate change. But there's a general feel of it being a Western political tool of some sort. So I would love at the end of the day for you to clarify that.
Right. So, and I think this is probably kind of a common feeling in developing countries where they feel like, you know, the United States and Europe produced all these greenhouse gases for all these years, and now they're saying to the other countries, don't use energy because, you know, climate change is a bad thing. And it's very hypocritical, you know. I mean, if the United States doesn't want the rest of the world to produce greenhouse gases, then we should provide technologies that can create the energy that's needed, right? Which is a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so anyway, the Science Council for Global Initiatives is an international think tank, basically, of scientists that deal mainly with technology issues and a lot with nuclear power. It was actually started at the inspiration of Dr. Belikov, who was the director of the Kurchatov Institute. Some of you may have heard of him. He's quite an interesting character, and he's been one of the major advisors to all the presidents since Gorbachev. We became friends about 10 years ago, and he wrote his autobiography. I said, you got to write your autobiography. You have a fascinating life story. And he wrote his autobiography, and then we translated it. So what I've done is I'm going to refer to a couple of books here today, and I put the books on a flash drive, and I left it with your director here. So one of the books is Dr. Belikov's autobiography. I would encourage you to read it. It's quite a fascinating story. He was the person who started the ITER project, and his inspiration also led to a project that became the Human Genome Project. He's an incredible guy. So so those books are going to be available on PDF. You can just ask for them. Now, normally I try not to use too many words in my slides because I've sat through too many death by PowerPoint presentations. So this is an unusual one, but what the Science Council is trying to do is to create the conditions for energy egalitarianism, where everybody on the planet could have access to as much inexpensive energy as every other country. And if you look at this graph, this shows what would happen if the United States, if the United States would cut their energy consumption by 50% per capita between 2005 and 2050, and how much energy it would take if everybody else on the planet was to use the same amount of energy as the Americans. Now, at this time, there are about 3 billion people on the planet that use less energy than an American refrigerator. And this is just not acceptable if you have any sense of social justice whatsoever. So our whole goal is to try and figure out how can we produce clean energy at a rate that can raise the standard of living for everybody on the planet. And you have to produce a lot of energy. You can see that we're going to have to probably triple the amount of energy that we're producing in the world. So right now, this graph is not real clear, but clean energy, non-fossil fuel energy only produces a relatively small proportion. And of that, most of it is hydro and nuclear. Nuclear produces about 10% of the world's electricity, but only about 4% of the world's energy. So there's a big gap to be filled. And you can see wind and solar. This graph it's a little bit older. Wind and solar would be a little bit bigger now, but still very small. So how do you get enough green energy? Google decided they wanted to start using just clean energy for all their servers, and Google uses a tremendous amount of energy. An iPhone with all the supporting infrastructure uses about as much energy as a refrigerator. So Google has to produce lots and lots of energy, and they wanted to do it green. So they did a project called RE is less than C. They wanted to figure out, how do you make renewable energy cheaper than coal? And they hired a bunch of engineers and physicists to figure out, okay, how are we going to do this? There's got to be a way to do this. Well, the result, after they spent, I don't know how many millions of dollars doing this, was the team came back and they said, well, we can't make renewable energy cheaper than coal. But not only that, we can't make enough renewable energy to run modern civilization. It's just not going to make it. Wind and solar is not going to make it. Hydro is good, but it's not available everywhere. And at certain times, it diminishes tremendously. Like in California, we have a lot of hydroelectric power, but we had 3 years of drought in California, and so the hydroelectric stations weren't able to produce very much. So basically what they came up with was, we have to have something besides renewable energy, and if you don't want fossil fuels, you need nuclear power. Well, meanwhile, there are people, there's particularly one engineer at Stanford University in the United States who has claimed that all you need is wind and solar and hydropower, that it's enough. And he's not the only one, but this is a particularly influential person in terms of getting millions of people to believe that all you need is more windmills and solar panels. And his studies that he does aren't peer-reviewed, so he just puts these out there and he gets celebrities, movie stars, and politicians to say, oh yeah, that's all we need is more wind and solar. So, you know, the question is there any truth to that? Well, if you're going to use wind and solar, using his numbers for land use, how much land it takes for wind and solar to produce enough energy to power the world, you would have to cover an area the size of South America with windmills and solar panels. Now, clearly, even if you could do that economically, the environmental damage would be just ridiculous. On the other hand, if you were going to do it with fast reactors, you could do it with an area the size of Buenos Aires. So now here's a thing that you can't find online anymore, but this shows all the solar energy that's being produced in Germany, Germany being the country that's developed solar and wind more than any other country. They've just sunk billions and billions of euros into it. And so the little graph on the upper right side shows the time of day, and then below it shows how many gigawatts are being produced. And you can see that they can produce quite a bit. And this is from all the solar installations in Germany, okay? But of course, then you have nighttime and nothing happens. But they made a big deal out of it. One day there was a really sunny day in Germany, and they said, we produced all the energy we needed, all the electricity we needed from just solar. But that was for like an hour or something. But one of the big problems is not just the daily fluctuation, but it's the seasonal fluctuation. So this shows a week in Germany during the winter when solar produces essentially nothing for an entire week. So even if you had backup systems, which we don't have utility scale storage systems that we can use, but people people who are trying to sell the renewables only concept always talk about, oh, we're going to develop energy storage systems on a utility scale. Well, it's crazy. How many batteries would it take to run an aluminum smelter or something? Or how many batteries would it take to provide all the electricity for Germany for a week in the wintertime? It's just not feasible. So, and then they say, well, if the sun's not shining, the wind is there. But you can see this is this is a comparison that, well, you can see with the wind, it just goes up and down. But you can see that the carbon intensity in Germany, with all the billions that they put into wind and solar, it's just, they still have lots and lots of carbon emissions compared to France, which of course produces most of their electricity with nuclear. So Germany, they want to shut down all their nuclear plants. So they're digging up lignite, the dirtiest kind of coal, on a massive scale using these gigantic machines, and their carbon intensity is just getting worse. Now, among people who are promoting all wind and solar, there's a lot of talk about, oh, we're completely upending the old power systems, right? And they look at this as a really good thing. The utility companies, the way they operated, the idea of baseload power, that doesn't make any sense. And they talk about it like this is a good thing, but here you can see that you need backup systems for when you don't have enough wind and solar. And the backup systems have to keep running even when there's so much energy that the price of electricity goes below zero, right? So you've got a natural gas power plant, and it's supposed to be online so that if the wind stops blowing suddenly or some clouds go over the sun, it can kick in. And so they have to keep producing electricity, which means they have to keep burning and paying for gas. And when the price of electricity during the day, when the sun is shining bright and the wind happens to be blowing, there's so much electricity that the price is negative. So the natural gas plant is still running, it's still paying for gas, and it's paying the utility companies for the electricity that they're making, but they're not able to sell it, right? I mean, they're actually producing electricity and they have to pay for producing electricity that nobody is using. So the whole system is untenable. It just doesn't work. And the only reason that it's working in Germany is because they rely on their neighbors, so that when they don't have enough electricity from wind and solar, they can buy electricity from France that's produced with nuclear. And when they have too much electricity, they can dump it into their neighboring countries, which then destabilizes the grid in their neighboring countries. And some of their neighbors are starting to build systems to block their electricity from coming in. Some of them just, the price of electricity goes negative, and Sweden, for instance, says, okay, we'll take your excess energy. And so Germany dumps their electricity into Sweden and pays the Swedes to take it, right? So, but the people with the solar panels, they're still getting paid because they have feed-in tariffs, right? So the whole system is just nuts. So anyway, this is another case. I mean, there are many, many days like this when the gas companies and the nuclear power plants, any baseload power plant is just being driven out of business because of the way the whole system is structured. Now, there have been quite a few studies done that have looked, very rigorously at this situation with renewables. And I wrote an article about this with a lot of links to different studies that you can look at. So if you look at this URL, you can go read that article, and then all those links will be there. And I would encourage you to look at it because I'm sure that many of you, being in the energy field, talk to people regularly about wind and solar, and you probably know a lot of people that think all we need is windmills and solar panels, and nuclear power is scary. So I would encourage you to go and check this out and look at some of these articles. And I'm going to be adding more to that because if you're looking at the data, it becomes very clear that wind and solar just isn't going to work. And like I said, this presentation is available from your professor there, so you don't have to write this down or anything. Okay, so if we're going to use nuclear power for powering the planet, if we want to get away from fossil fuels, it's the only backup system that's going to work. So what kind is going to work? Well, you know, now we have light water reactors, as you know, around the world, and they're quite expensive. They're massive building projects. This is the project that's being built in the state of Georgia in the southeastern United States. And, you know, it can be done economically. The economics can work. France, and it can be done quickly. This is what happened with France when they decided to start nuclear power. They went from 20% to 80% nuclear in 11 years. But during that 11 years, they actually increased their electricity demand. They doubled it. So they actually went from 10% to 80% in 11 years. So even using light water reactors, it's absolutely possible to convert an entire country to nuclear power very quickly using old style systems. Now, I went to a conference recently on small modular reactors, and General Electric did a study about nuclear cost, and what they did was they looked at different prices for nuclear. When does nuclear start getting more popular from an economic standpoint? And they could see that if you can get the price of nuclear down to $2,000 a kilowatt, then you can get nuclear to the point where it can produce about half of the electricity. The utility companies are going to want to buy these plants because it's going to be an economical thing. But if you go $3,000 a kilowatt or $4,000, you know, then people aren't going to want to use it. So they're trying to hit that $2,000 sweet spot. So they downsized one of their new reactor designs, the ESBWR, to what they call a BWR X300. It's a boiling water reactor, 300 megawatt electric. And they got the price down so far to $22.50 per kilowatt, almost to the sweet spot of 2,000. They're struggling to get to 2,000. But you can see deployable by 2028. They might get it down to 2,000, but of course there's going to be inflation. But 2028 is still a long ways away. And when you look at the amount of greenhouse gases that are getting poured into the atmosphere, if they just get started with this at 2028, how long before you can build hundreds of them or thousands of them to try and distribute them around the world, deploy them around the world? It's going to be quite hard. Now, there's a company called NuScale that some of you have probably heard about. They're the first company to take the small modular reactor concept through the incredibly difficult Nuclear Regulatory Commission process in the United States, which generally costs about $1 billion just to get a license, a design approved. Now, NuScale's reactor modules are only 60 megawatts electric. So they're too small to get the economies of scale really working. At $3,600 per kilowatt, it's not going to be very attractive. It can still pay. If you want to get away from fossil fuels, it can still work. But you know, you need, what, 15 reactors to get to a gigawatt. So they're building it. It is a light water reactor system also. Then you have the eVinci, that's a Westinghouse design, and their target price is $2 a watt, $2,000 a kilowatt. But these are small reactors again. These are 200 to 25 megawatts. You know, it has distinct advantages, but it's for use in remote locations, mining, you know, villages up in Alaska or wherever, but not really for big cities. And then you have the ARC 100, which is a metal-fueled fast reactor design that's based on what was the EBR-2 system that was developed in the United States, which I wrote about in my book, which is also on the flash drive that's available to you. And I was talking to one of the people that works at ARC, and he said they can't get their price down below $3,500 a kilowatt. They don't know how they can do it. Okay, so I referred to the EBR-2. This was a fast reactor project that was started in 1984. Well, the reactor itself was built before 1984, but in 1984, they got a director who decided he was going to try to solve all the problems associated with nuclear power: safety, waste, economics, the whole works. He assembled a team, an international team of engineers and scientists, and they worked on this for 10 years, and they came up with this fast reactor concept with metal fuel and a recycling system that they can recycle everything, and it works great, extremely safe. And now there are 4 companies that are developing that technology. General Electric has the PRISM. They're building the first PRISM reactor. It's going to be operational in 2026 at a national laboratory in Idaho. You have the ARC system that I talked about before. You have the TerraPower system, which Bill Gates got involved in. And it started out as what they called a traveling wave reactor. I'm sure some of you have looked at this. The idea was that you have a big log of depleted uranium, and you start a breeder fission process at one end, and then it burns down for 60 years like a cigarette. The concept was not really feasible, and I engaged with the CEO of the company that was developing this, along with one of the scientists that had worked on the EBR-2 project, who's the world's leading expert in this technology. Yoon Chang, his name is. He's a Korean guy. And Yoon was telling the CEO of TerraPower, look, the system is not going to work. You don't understand how this works. And he kind of ran away. He said, oh, I don't have time for all these emails. And he didn't want to. Yoon was asking him too many difficult questions. And so Yoon and I would laugh about it, and we'd say, you just watch TerraPower in the future. What's going to happen is they're going to keep modifying it, and it's going to get more and more just like a PRISM reactor, just like an EBR-2, But the thing is that the company that created TerraPower, they're what we call a patent troll company. They're a company that wants to get intellectual property so they can make a lot of money, right? And they couldn't just go to General Electric and say, build us a PRISM, because then they have no intellectual property. So they wanted to develop their own system and make a lot of money. So we've watched this system in the years since, and exactly what we said was going to happen has happened. They keep modifying it, and it gets more and more like just a regular fast reactor. Now they've kind of started looking at molten salt reactors. And they were working with China, but Donald Trump recently terminated all nuclear power technology transfer with China. And I'm afraid that it was partly due to a project that I've been involved with, because there was a Chinese company that we were looking for backing for building a power plant that I'll talk about a little bit later in my talk. And we needed $800 million to build this. So a big Chinese company said, okay, we got the money, we're going to do this. And we need just approval from the Chinese government. So they got the approval from the Chinese government. And so they said, okay, great. Everybody was happy, right? Come to Beijing, we'll have a meeting, we'll set up the contract. And 3 days later, Donald Trump put an embargo on nuclear power technology transfer with China, specifically mentioning floating nuclear reactors, which was the project that we were working on. So I don't know how it happened. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, okay? So, it could have been a big light water reactor company in China that didn't want this to happen. It could have been the National Security Agency that, was listening into the conversations, and they didn't want China to be doing this with the US. I don't know, but the coincidence of this happening within 3 days of this deal, and specifically mentioning floating reactors is just kind of too much of a coincidence. So, but anyway, when Trump terminated that technology transfer, he also messed up Bill Gates. So Bill can't do his project in China anymore either. And then the fourth one is Oklo, which is specializing in building a very small fast reactor for small villages in the Arctic and industrial projects. Now, in my book, I had written about fast reactors because I was trying to look down the road at power production and how many years you could provide with existing fuel supplies. And you can look at this graph some other time, but basically you can see that if you ran the whole world on conventional oil, you could only have 16 years worth. If you ran the whole world on conventional natural gas, you'd have 16 years. And you can see that if you burn uranium in fast reactors, you've got almost 50,000 years worth of fuel. So it's kind of a logical thing to look at this. This is something that I'm sure is familiar to all of you, the amount of isotopes in the various sources of fuel. And this is your BN 800, which I hope it gets built more and more around the world. I've been trying to convince Rosatom to build to offer fast reactors to Africa, combined with hybrid systems for desalination, because there's a lot of countries, well, in Africa especially, but in other continents as well, that are in desperate need of water. And when you produce nuclear power, you know very well that a nuclear power plant is capable of running 24 hours a day at full power, and the cost of fuel is really trivial. So if you have a country that really needs water, the logical thing is to build a hybrid plant like the BN 350 that was built in Kazakhstan back in the 60s, I think, or 70s, and produce vast amounts of water that could create agricultural industries in places that are too dry right now. Now, the Science Council got involved with a fuel recycling project a few years back. This was a technology that had been developed with the EBR2 system, and at the time, the Department of Energy in the United States said, well, you know, we're going to put all of our spent oxide fuel from all our light water reactors, we're going to put all our nuclear waste into this mountain in Nevada. So if you want to recycle fuel, just do a project that would recycle the metal fuel that you're going to use in your reactors. So they had this constricted role, so they developed this system to recycle the fuel, take all the actinides out, put it into new fuel, and reduce the radiotoxicity of the fuel from tens of thousands of years to about 300 years. Now, when they stopped under Bill Clinton, they stopped the IFR project in 1994, and nothing happened to this. It was actually suppressed by the Department of Energy. You couldn't find information about it. And the deputy director of the National Laboratory, Yun Chang, the same one I was talking about before, he really, really wanted to design and build this recycling plant. And he couldn't get any support from it at all. Most people didn't even understand what it was. And he was my main teacher in advanced nuclear power. And so I really wanted to help him do this, but we just couldn't get any traction. And so finally he decided to retire. And he was about 68 years old. And so he retired. And then shortly after that, I was contacted by a multi-billionaire. And the guy said, you know, I really want to do something about climate change. What can I do to help? And now we had just we had just had a meeting with the Secretary of Energy. This was when Stephen Chu was Secretary of Energy, who was a real physicist, not like the Secretary of Energy we have now under Donald Trump. And I would apologize for Donald Trump, except I apologize for Donald Trump in every country I go to except Russia, because because Russia helped get him elected. But I still apologize for Donald Trump. So we have a crazy Secretary of Energy that doesn't know anything now, and it's just a mess. But at this time, Stephen Chu was Secretary of Energy, and he was a real physicist. He was a Nobel laureate, I think. So we had set up a meeting with Yun Chang and Stephen Chu and a congressman that I work with and some other scientists, and we talked about, could we build this thing? And after the meeting, the congressman went back to his office and he wrote a letter to Stephen Chu and he said, look, we've decided that we can design this commercial scale recycling plant that can recycle all types of fuel, not just metal fuel, but oxide fuel, all the spent fuel we've got, all the so-called nuclear waste that everybody's worried about. We can design this thing. It'll take about 2 years. It'll cost about $10 million. We can do it at Argonne National Laboratory. So how about if we find $5 million from the private sector, would the Department of Energy then pay the other $5 million, and then we could do this project? So he sends this letter to Stephen Chu, the Secretary of Energy. Then he calls me on the phone. He said, Tom, you got to find $5 million. And I go, where am I going to find $5 million, right? So just a week or two later, I get a $5,000 check in the mail for our organization. And there's just a name on the check. There's no address. I had no idea who this person was. I wrote to him. There was just an email address. It said a donation. So I wrote to him and I said, the kind of work we're doing at the Science Council, it involves negotiating with governments and things like that. So I really can't put all this on our website, but I really appreciate your donation. So if you want to call me on the phone, I'll tell you about the work we're doing. So he calls me on the phone, and I find out that he's like this incredibly rich guy. And so he asked me to come and visit him. So I go to visit him, and he says, what can I do to help? And I said, well, we just had this meeting with the Secretary of Energy, and I got to find $5 million. He said, who do I make the check out to? And so he did. We set up a meeting in Washington. He brought his lawyers. They put the money in. They did the pyroprocessing project. He said, well, who's going to run the project? I said, Yun will run it. He was retired, of course, at this point, right? But I knew that Yun would come out of retirement to do this project. So I called Yun, and he was delighted, and he came out of retirement, and they designed the project, and it's all ready to build now. This was about 3 years ago. So we essentially have a commercial scale recycling system for all types of nuclear fuel. It can recycle fuel from molten salt reactors, from oxide fuel reactors, and from metal fueled fast reactors. It's still not built. South Korea has built a small one. They haven't turned it on yet because of pressure from the United States. South Korea is probably going to be the country that does this first. Partly because they're concerned about what they're going to do with all their spent fuel, partly because they want to build fast reactors and they want to run metal-fueled fast reactors. And the United States, I got involved with the negotiations with the Koreans because the United States was trying to stop them from doing this. And they stalled them for the U.S. was being very unreasonable, but Korea has a lot of commercial relationships with the United States, and so they didn't want to get the U.S. angry at them. So they built this pyroprocessing facility. They just didn't turn it on. And they know how to do this. So they came, part of the deal was that if you don't do this now, you can send your scientists and your students over to Argonne National Laboratories and we'll do research on recycling. So for 10 years. So they did this project at Argonne National Laboratories. So they've been involved in this entire thing. So the Koreans absolutely know how to do this. And they've also been designing their own fast reactor to use this metal fuel. And it's going to be ready to build next year. So I think next year is going to be the turning point with the relationship between the U.S. and South Korea, where South Korea is going to go, okay, we're going to do this. You know, no more stalling. Now, the pyroprocessing system is incredibly simple and small compared to aqueous reprocessing, like the kind they do in France. It's also way cheaper. And you can look at this later. This compares pyroprocessing to aqueous reprocessing, which is, you know, many times, you know, 5 to 10 times more expensive and inefficient. But you can recycle everything into fast reactor fuel if you wish. I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but this is so that you can look at it later. You can get some idea of the fuel cycles, both with the fast reactors and metal-fueled fast reactors and with light water reactors. And the thing about fast reactors that was really attractive to me was the fact that it can burn depleted uranium as fuel. And it's so efficient, and we have so much depleted uranium already out of the ground that if you built fast reactors to power the planet, you have enough fuel to run the whole planet for almost 1,000 years. So you wouldn't have to mine anything anymore. You could stop mining oil and gas and coal and uranium. You wouldn't have to mine uranium anymore. And this is just a small amount of the depleted uranium that the U.S. has. I think Russia has at least as much as the U.S. Because Russia's also been taking depleted uranium from France and getting paid for it. So in actuality, whoever worked out that deal for Russia should get a medal because, you know, essentially France has been wanting to get rid of its depleted uranium for strictly political reasons, right? And so they pay Russia to take this fuel, and ultimately you can power the planet with it. So anyway, most of you are probably familiar with fast reactors. This is a sodium fast reactor, a simplified version of it that was developed at Argonne National Laboratory, and similar to what the BN reactors are doing. And one of the critical things about the fast reactors is that you can operate them at atmospheric pressure. And if you're talking about powering the planet with nuclear power, you're going to have to build thousands of reactors. And if you want to build thousands of reactors, it's much, much easier to build reactors that operate at atmospheric pressure. You don't have the bottleneck of building high-pressure vessels. So fast reactors are a good way to do it, like the PRISM reactor. Okay, so anyway, this is the book that talks about the project, the IFR project. And this is the book that was written by the director and of the laboratory and Yoon Chang, who was the manager of the project. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about this because metal fuel for fast reactors is something that hasn't been developed for Russian fast reactors yet, but Sergei Kiriyenko, when he was the director of Rosatom, until he started working in Putin's office, I talked to him about using metal fuel in Russian fast reactors. And he said, well, that's something that we're going to be doing. We're going to eventually convert to metal fuel. Chuck Till and Yoon Chang, in their book, they talk a lot about the development of metal-fueled fast reactors and why they chose sodium instead of lead, for instance, and the entire history of the project. And I think you'll find it quite interesting. One of the main things is they realized early on that metal fuel had a lot of intrinsic advantages, one of them being that it's very easy to fabricate if you could fabricate it. But the problem is that it swells up like 40% when it's burning. So every time they would make the fuel pins and they'd put them into cladding, then, you know, as soon as they get a little burn up, it just pops the cladding. And so they decided, well, we're going to try to figure out a way to do this. And the British had been working on fast reactors, and they also realized that it would be a really good idea to use metal fuel. And they'd been working on it for years and years, hadn't been able to figure out how to do this because it just swells up too much. And so they told the guys at Argonne National Laboratory, forget about it, you know, we tried that. You can't do that. And so I was talking to Chuck Till, the director. I said, well, how did you ever come up with the idea that you figured out how to do this with the fuel that swells up so much? He said, well, a bunch of us were just sitting around in my office one day, and we were just kind of scratching our heads trying to figure this out. And one of the guys said, well, you know, we know that sodium transfers heat really well. So how about if we just make the fuel pins really small and put sodium inside the cladding with the fuel pins? And then as it swells up, you know, the heat will transfer to the cladding and you'll get the heat transfer that you want, but you won't break the cladding if you just leave enough space in the top for the expansion. So, and they realized that the problem was that you were getting fission products that were gases and they were forming bubbles in the fuel pins, right? And so as these bubbles would form, the fuel would swell. And so they decided, well, okay, we can do this. And the sodium will just be forced up into the plenum at the top as the fuel pin swells. And then if we make it to the size so that when it gets 40% bigger, it hits the cladding, then it's going to work. Well, what happens is when you get to that point, the bubbles start to form channels. They start meeting each other. And then the gases start escaping from outside of the fuel pin, and the gases go up into the plenum, and the sodium that was up in the plenum, because it got forced up there by the swelling, comes back down into the fuel pins and runs inside the fuel pin into the holes that are developed by the gases, right? So you get really good heat transfer the whole time, and it works great. And it's just completely simple, but people worked on it for years and years and years trying to figure this out. And there was just some guy that goes, well, wait a minute, let's just make them small. Now, there's some tremendous advantages to this, because if you're going to be running fast reactors with U-235 and U-238, you're going to have to fabricate your fuel out of plutonium that has several different plutonium isotopes. That makes it difficult. You can't do it like you can with light water reactor fuel. You have to do this remotely, so you don't want to have to machine the fuel pins down to microns, right? So with this type of technology, you can say, okay, well, we want a fuel pin 6 inches long, plus or minus 4 inches, right? I mean, it doesn't matter, right? You just have to, you got this fuel pin rattling around in there, and it works fine. So it's really easy to fabricate remotely. All you have to do is melt it. You mix it with zirconium and you melt it, and you pour it into glass tubes, and that's your fuel pin. You just pop it out of the glass tubes, put it into the plenum, or put it into the cladding and pop the plug on the end. So they've done all this. They've recycled over 35,000 fuel pins, and I mean, it's a technology that's totally understood and well proven. But I would encourage you, like, especially since I think Russia is going to be converting to this eventually, I would encourage you to read particularly this section of the book, but also the section about coolants, because Yoon talks in there a lot about lead coolant and the disadvantages of lead compared to sodium. Now, one thing about sodium fast reactors that bothered me from the beginning was the sodium water problem, right? It's basically an engineering problem. You create a sodium fast reactor and you've got radioactive sodium, but you don't have any water in that building, okay? You have your steam system in a building next door, and you run the heat over with a non-radioactive sodium loop. So, and you have an argon environment around there, so you don't have a problem with water and air. But a lot of people, when you talk to them about sodium fast reactors, that's their big question, you know. What happens, say, if you get a terrorist that comes in and blows up a sodium fast reactor? And then you get all this radioactive sodium spewing into the atmosphere, and then it's burning, and you get water, and you know, what happens if you get a tsunami and an earthquake? And so I tried for years to come up with, to try to understand why sodium, you know, why can't we use something else? But there are so many advantages to sodium. For one thing, it's completely non-reactive with the metals that are used in reactors. So in the EBR-2, they ran a reactor for 30 years, and they took it apart, and they looked, and they could still see the marks from the welders when they had first welded the reactor. So that and its excellent heat transfer properties and its low cost, there are many, many advantages, but it always kind of bothered me. And after I wrote my book, I started finding out about molten salt reactors. Now, back during the Cold War, the United States wanted to figure out a way to make nuclear-powered bombers so that we could keep bombers in the air for a week or 2 weeks or a month at a time, just so that we could be ready to drop bombs on the Soviet Union, right? So they assigned a job to Oak Ridge National Laboratories. They said, we want you to make a nuclear-powered jet. And so they came up with this idea. Well, they realized that using solid fuel would be all kinds of problems because of the G-forces involved with maneuvering a jet. So they came up with this idea of making molten salt reactors where you would have the uranium or the plutonium dissolved in salt. And it would be basically a liquid reactor. And the idea started, again, they did this project, like the EBR-2, they did this project at a national laboratory. They ran one for 4 years. It worked really well. And then they just killed the project. They decided, oh, we're going to build light water reactors. And so it was kind of forgotten about until about 10 years ago. One guy found out about it. He started thinking, well, you know, this sounds really good. And he's kind of started resurrecting the idea. Then a lot more people started getting involved with it. And it's a really excellent concept. And the director of Oak Ridge National Laboratory that developed this technology was also developing light water reactor technology, which had been used in the Navy originally, and then they just started scaling up the Navy reactors, and that's why we end up with light water reactors, which are really not the best kind of reactor. And so the director of the lab that developed the molten salt reactor, he thought that in the future, everybody will use molten salt. It's a really great concept. It's much safer, much easier to build, operates at atmospheric pressure. But the thing is that whereas a light water reactor operates at about 350 degrees centigrade, a molten salt reactor operates at about 700. And you also have the issue of the corrosion effects of salt, especially at those high temperatures and in a neutron flux. So the people that started looking at this and designing molten salt reactors, they were trying to figure out, how do I make a reactor that lasts 60 to 80 years like a light water reactor under these conditions, these material conditions? And I would always ask them, what are you going to build it out of? And they'd say, oh, well, you know, there's new alloys now, they'll work great. And I go, you don't know that, right? You just graduated from MIT, you never built anything, right? And it was funny because I called up Chuck Till, the guy who had been the manager of the IFR project, the director of the lab. And I started talking to him. I asked him what he thought about molten salt reactors, and his first question is, what are you going to build them out of? And so I looked at all the advantages of molten salt reactors for quite a few years, but I could never get over the materials challenge. How you're going to make this work? Until I found out about this company called Thorcon, and Thorcon was basically two brothers who were shipbuilders, and they designed the largest ship in the world, a great big oil tanker called the Fairfax. And then they went over to South Korea, which has the most high-tech shipyards. And they built this gigantic ship in 10 months for $89 million. Really cheap, really fast. And it worked great. So they built 3 more. So the 4 biggest ships in the world running around were jack ships. And then he got to thinking, you know, if we can build ships using these so fast and so cheap using modern shipbuilding technology, a lot of automatic welding systems and that sort of thing, what if we could build nuclear reactors that way? And he didn't know much about nuclear power, so he organized a team of nuclear physicists from national laboratories and some nuclear engineers, started this little company called Thorcon. And they looked at all the different types of reactor systems that might be usable in shipbuilding techniques, and they realized that molten salt reactors would be great for that, right? So the picture on the right is from the Oak Ridge fast reactor. Basically, it's a really simple system, which most of you are probably familiar with, so I won't go into great detail, but basically you have slabs of high-density graphite that you run molten salt through, and it has uranium or plutonium dissolved in it, and as it moves through the graphite, the neutrons slow down, it starts the fission process, so the salt coming out of the top of the pot is hot. You run it into a pump that's about garden hose pressure, just to keep the system running. And then you run it into a heat exchanger, and then you run it back into the bottom of the pot. It's very simple. It's fairly self-regulating. If it starts getting too hot, the reactivity slows down a little bit. If there's ever any kind of reaction that makes it too hot, you have a freeze plug at the bottom. So then it would just drain down into an emergency drain tank where it would cool down and turn into solid salt, because the melting point of the salt that we'd be using in the case of Thorcon is about 300 C. The operating temperature is about 700 C. So the question was, you know, how fast can these be built? How cheaply can they be built? And they realized that a small shipyard can build at least 10 gigawatts. A large shipyard can build 25 gigawatts of modules, Thorcon modules, right? And they're 250 megawatt electric modules. Now, when you look at the pace, the speed of building something, I used to compare the building of the prism reactors to building of bombers during World War II, because I knew several of the engineers that had designed the prism reactor, and they said, oh, it's much easier to build a prism reactor than a bomber, right? And you know, you built 16,000 bombers in the first 8 months in 1945. So I mean, the problem is not, can we build reactors fast enough to power the world? We absolutely can do that. Now, the original plan with Thorcon was to dig silos along oceans and navigable waterways and build these modules and put them on a ship, and then just take a crane and lift the modules out and put them in the silo, and then you put the turbine, the generators on shore, the switch yard, all the control mechanisms, everything is on shore. And I was thinking, well, you know, that can work fine in many countries, but don't we want to power the whole world? I mean, don't we want to provide this opportunity and this generating capacity to countries that aren't nuclear capable, that countries that may be very poor? You're going to have all kinds of problems. If you do it in some countries with big environmental movements, you're going to have people saying, oh, we don't want nuclear power. If you do it in countries where there's a lot of corruption in the government, you're going to have problems with that. You're definitely going to have problems with quality control. So when I first got involved with these guys, I was thinking about trying to build these in developing countries. And I said, well, you guys already know how to build the biggest ships in the world, right? So why don't you build the whole power plant on a ship? And this is before the Russians built theirs. And the initial reaction was negative, but after about 3 months of gradual brainstorming, they crunched all the numbers and they figured out, you know, how much the materials would cost and what would happen in the event of a tsunami and all the different potential problems with doing it on a ship. And MIT had been working on the concept of putting them on floating platforms like are used for oil and gas drilling in the North Sea. But the MIT concept was to build an AP1000 light water reactor on these oil platforms. So the concept of doing it at sea was something that was definitely being worked on. And this is, one of the concepts for doing it this way. This is I believe this is the Fairfax. And when I looked at how big the ship would have to be to build a 1 gigawatt power plant and put it on a ship, it's really small compared to the size ships that they were building. So after about 3 months, they realized, oh, this is a really good idea. And so they designed a power ship that's a complete power plant on a ship. All you have to do is just plug it into the grid. You got the switchyard, the generators, the whole thing. And so they designed these 500 megawatt power ships that would have 2 operational modules on each ship. You could very easily put 4 on there, or 6, or even 8, making them slightly larger. But one of the nice things about this, besides the fact that you could sell electricity just like a utility company, right, to virtually any country, you wouldn't have to transfer nuclear technology. And so the question of nuclear proliferation gets kind of much more under control. And so then you look at, well, this could be really good in countries where there's very little money to build a big power plant, right? If you could just float a ship in there, a power ship, and plug it into the grid and just sell electricity, just like you and I buy electricity from our local utility company, right? Then you could start producing and providing inexpensive energy to virtually any country, and very quickly raising standards of living. So, so the question was, and then every 4 years, this is another thing. What got me started with the Thorcon guys in the beginning was the fact that that they said they were going to meet the materials challenges of building these reactors by making a reactor that was disposable after 4 years. They said, we know it'll last 4 years because we ran one for 4 years at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And we can make them so cheap and so fast that we could just throw them away after 4 years. And the economics will still work. So that's why I got involved with them. And also because they weren't a couple students from MIT. These guys were accomplished industrialists. They had built lots of big ships, and they understood all the aspects of doing big industrial projects. So anyway, if you build these power plants and you just float them in, and then every 4 years you send in a can ship and you just swap out the reactor modules. Now there's an organization in Boston called the Clean Air Task Force, and oops, I'm getting too long. Am I going too long here? How much time do I have? Okay. The Clean Air Task Force, huh? Okay. The Clean Air Task Force is an environmental organization, but they're very data-driven, and they really pay attention to real science. And they're pretty crazy about the Thorcon idea, so they thought, well, how many power ships could we build if we just used existing shipyard capacity around the world that's not being used now? And the number they came up with was 400 gigawatts per year. Now, 400 gigawatts is the entire nuclear fleet of the entire world right now. So, in other words, we could double, assuming that we started them all up at the same time, which of course we wouldn't do, but 400 gigawatts per year is quite the speed. Now, like I was saying earlier, nuclear power provides 10% of the world's electricity. So if you were going to do this at 400 gigawatts per year, 10 years, you could basically produce all the electricity that the world is using now. But we're going to need a lot more electricity because developing countries want a lot more electricity. We're starting to electrify transport. And ultimately, in terms of clean energy, you want to electrify everything if you can. So, and nuclear only provides 4% of the world's energy. So if you want to make that 4% 100%, that's a 25-year project. But if you're doubling your energy demand in that time, that's a 50-year or 40-year project. So it would be worth it economically to bring online all these shipyards that aren't being used and upgrade them as necessary, because you're talking about a project that's going to last over half a century and create tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of good-paying jobs and produce clean energy all over the planet. So, so the question then is, well, is this economical? And remember, we were looking for a price of $2,000 a kilowatt. And so one of the shipyards in South Korea that had built ships for the Devaney brothers, who started Thorcon, they said, we're going to take a look at this, and we're going to give you a bid. We're going to tell you how much we can build your power ships for. And the price they came up with was $1,000 a kilowatt, $1 a watt, which would make it the cheapest source of energy around anywhere. And if you can build them that fast and build them that cheap, and they're incredibly safe, the problems you have with light water reactor accidents like Fukushima, they don't exist. If you had a terrorist come in and blow up one of these power plants, you would have all this radioactive salt going up into the sky, and immediately it would turn solid, because at 300 C it turns solid, right? And so you'd have radioactive salt. And the iodine and the strontium and the cesium that are problems in nuclear accidents, they're all chemically bound to the salt. So you essentially don't have any evacuation zones. And you could even have these built offshore or anchored offshore, and not even within sight of cities, so people wouldn't be upset about it. So the whole idea is entirely practical, and we can do this. And the Thorcon guy said they could do it in 4 years. So I asked various directors of national laboratories in the United States, including Chuck Till, who'd done the IFR project, including the CEO of General Electric, people who were really good nuclear engineers that really had experience building things. And they all agreed, you should easily be able to do that in 4 years, as long as you aren't stopped by regulatory hurdles, like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So they decided to look for another country to build these reactors, and Indonesia came to them and said, we really want nuclear power in Indonesia. How fast could you build these reactors? And they said 4 years. And the Indonesians said, could you do it in 3? They said, you're the people we want to talk to. So they started negotiating with the Indonesians, which has been going on now for about 3 years, and there was some resistance. Actually, there were some people in the energy sector in the Indonesian government who were very friendly with Rosatom, and Rosatom wanted to build reactors in Indonesia, the VVERs, and eventually they told Rosatom, no, we're going to do this Thorcon project. And it's gotten to the point now where it's got the full support of the government and the president of Indonesia. And of course, Indonesia is an island nation, right? There's nothing better for them than power plants on ships, right? It's a logical thing. So they just had a presidential election, and I was crossing my fingers that Jokowi, the current president, would be reelected, and he did get reelected. They just announced it last week. So it's highly likely that Indonesia is going to be the place where this is first tested. They've already offered Thorcon an island to test it. And the Koreans have gotten very interested in this. Samsung has a huge shipyard. Other shipyards there are real interested in doing it. So there's all these talks going on now about financing the first project and getting it built. If we can do this in 4 years, within 3 years we would pretty much know that it's going to work. And the thing is, once it's demonstrated, you can start building these right away. They're very easy to build. So like the Samsung shipyards could start cranking these things out. I just put this on here because, you can read it later. But I mean, all the things you can do, basically you're producing electricity and energy so cheaply that at the price of $1 a watt, if you build a power ship, you could sell electricity to any country for half the average European electricity price and pay for the power ship in 1 year. Now, virtually any industrial project that pays for itself in a year is almost crazy, right? But you can actually do that with this. So you've got countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, Kazakhstan, UAE, and they're all looking at the rise of electric cars, right? People are, all the major car companies are talking about stopping to build internal combustion vehicles. They're all going to be going electric. Volvo is not even going to build any more internal combustion vehicles. So you're looking at a very near future when the price of oil is going to start dropping like crazy. And countries that depend on oil for the majority of their income, like your country, you know, they're looking at, well, what are we going to do? So, so the Saudis, you know, the Saudis obviously are going to be in hurting, and so they decided, okay, we're going to figure out what industries and technologies we should develop so that we can have a healthy economy when the oil price goes through the floor. And so they put $1 trillion into figuring this out, a post-oil fund. What should we do? Well, one of the first projects that they were proposed to was a South Korean company that said, hey, we'll build you the biggest high-tech shipyard in the world. And it was going to be several $billion. And the Saudis said, well, how is that a good business? There's all kinds of shipbuilding capacity in the world right now that's not being used. They go, don't worry, we guarantee you, we'll keep it busy. So the Saudis said, okay, and they pulled the trigger. So that's coming online, I think, this year. Biggest high-tech shipyard in the world. Well, I talked to Jack Devaney, the guy who designed the Thorcon plants. He goes, that guarantee to keep it busy? He said, there's nothing behind that. That company that guaranteed them, they used to build ships for me. He said, I know, this is absolutely untrue. So the Thorcon guys went to Saudi Arabia and they said, we can keep your shipyard busy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, building power ships. You can build fleets of power ships and you can keep powering the world. You just do it with clean energy instead of oil. So there's a lot of interest in Saudi Arabia at this point, and we were talking to everybody up to and including MBS, but then they killed that journalist in Turkey, and which you probably heard about, and so now everything's kind of slowed down. Talks with the United States are just, you know, kind of like this, but whoever ends up running Saudi Arabia, if MBS gets overthrown or if he stays in power, they're going to have this gigantic shipyard that they got to keep busy, and they could become the biggest utility company in the world. They could just sell electricity all over through all the developing nations in the world and all the power that they need for themselves. They want to build 40 reactors, 40 gigawatts of reactors, primarily for desalination. You're going to have also private companies, like big oil companies that have a lot of money. And, you know, where are they going to get their money after the price of oil starts going down? Well, they could become utility companies. And you're going to have countries like very possibly Russia that puts a lot of money into building shipyards. And this is a great thing to do in Crimea. It would create lots of great jobs in Crimea, right? So we were just talking about Crimea earlier today. So, you know, I'm very enthusiastic and optimistic about the future of nuclear in general. I think, you know, choosing to have a career in nuclear power, I think it's going to be great, especially if you like to travel, if you like to make money. I mean, it has to happen. Whatever you think about climate change, whatever, you know, Putin or Trump think about climate change politics is very real. And the more intense climate change politics gets, the better it is for nuclear power, because clearly that's the way around it. That's the solution to the problem. So I congratulate you on your choice of career, and I would encourage you, like, if you want to talk about any of this, you can contact me through our website, or you know, we can Skype or whatever. I'd be happy to discuss any of this with you in the future. One more thing I wanted to add. You've heard about EROI or EROEI, energy return on energy invested. People say, well, you know, it doesn't make sense to put 10 joules of energy into creating a fuel that you're only going to get 5 joules of energy out of, right? It's just crazy. But that concept itself is crazy, because what matters is not how much energy you put in and how much energy you get out. It's the value of the energy that you put in versus the value of the energy that you get out. And this was realized by some people in the US Navy when they started building the latest version of aircraft carriers that have 12 nuclear reactors on each aircraft carrier. And they're all running at idle. And somebody said, well, you know, we've got these tanker ships that come up alongside of us, and they load aviation fuel onto the aircraft carrier, and we got all these nuclear reactors running here. Why don't we just make our own fuel out of air and water, right? Because that's all you need is carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. We know how to do all this stuff, right? If you got all the extra energy, you can just take carbon dioxide out of the air or out of the water, and take hydrogen and oxygen out of the water, and you can just make jet fuel. So they started doing it, and of course it works, you know. And it's an example of what can happen if we start running the world on nuclear power. I mean, we're going to have so much excess energy because you have to build in enough capacity for meeting your peak demand. But peak demand is 2 or 3 times average demand, which means that if you build peak demand with nuclear power and the price of fuel is minimal, and they're good at running at full power 24/7, you're going to have essentially all the energy you need to run your electrical grids plus that much excess just for creating hydrogen, fresh water, ammonia, if you want to use ammonia as a hydrogen carrier for converting to, say, merchant ships to hydrogen. So, you know, we've got the capacity to do it, and that's what we're working on. So I took a lot of your time, but it's been a lot of fun. And I would take any questions if we still have time. I don't know.
Thank you.
Question?
Thank you for the lecture. Very inspirational. Thank you. About clean energy. Of course, this is important for me personally, and I think for everybody is here. I have a lot of questions actually. You were talking about political issues, about physics, about climate change, etc. So I think I will choose. So my small remark about molten salt, that in first seconds I think it will be too hot to emit the products, but I don't know. Nobody before blow reactors, yeah, experimentally. So, but how do you think about all this stuff about the floating reactors? Yeah.
About which one?
Ships.
Shipborne reactors?
Yeah. So we have running already. Do you know about Rosatom and?
Yeah, it's 75 megawatts.
Yeah.
It's pretty small.
You think that it's not so competitional to the projects of big one, yeah?
Well, that's also a light water reactor, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And it's a small reactor. We're talking about building, you know, half a gigawatt to 2 gigawatts on a single ship, right, to power entire countries.
Okay, I got it.
You know, there's a lot of political tensions between the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah.
Right? But I've been involved with the scientific community in both the U.S. and Russia for many years, and among the scientists, especially among the nuclear scientists, there's the feeling that whatever other political problems there are between the U.S. and Russia, we should cooperate on nuclear issues. For one thing, they're long-term issues, right? These are projects that go on for decades. For another thing, we both have a lot of talent and a lot of capacity, and any advances that are made in nuclear power technology don't just help the country that does it. It helps the whole world, right?
Yeah.
So among the scientific community, those diplomatic tensions aren't really there. They're seen just as a problem, you know. So, and you know, frankly, it doesn't matter to me if molten salt reactors end up getting built, or fast reactors, or if Russia builds them, or if China builds them. I don't care who builds them, or even what kind they are, as long as they're safe. You know, I just want to make sure that we get enough of them built so that we can get climate change under control. And in order to do that, you know, we got to do it really fast. Now, a project like this, people say, well, you know, you don't want to do it with China because they'll steal the technology. And I had a talk with some of the Kurchatov people, and they were saying, well, you know, we don't want to do such and such with China because they'll steal the technology. But when you look at a project like this, you're talking about, you know, trillions and trillions of dollars. I mean, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. The question of world security and climate.
Yeah, exactly.
This is more important.
You're going to be diminishing the tensions, the factors that make political tensions, right?
Yeah.
If you produce wealth by creating energy, if you produce enough water so that people don't have to have fights over water, you know, if you don't need oil anymore, so you don't have to go, you know, instead of shooting depleted uranium shells at people so you can steal their oil, you use depleted uranium in reactors, right? I mean, you know, ultimately, it's going to be such a big project to convert the entire world's infrastructure to nuclear power that the more the better, right? I mean, there shouldn't be any concept of competition, you know, because there's going to be enough for everybody.
Yeah, unfortunately, the real is something.
Yeah, well, you have to have the vision, right?
Yeah.
And then you have to get people that, you know, you can convince of the same vision. I'm working with one of the senators who's running for president, and, you know, we've got 24 of them, I think. 24 candidates that are running for president in 2020, but he's a very good one, and he has a good chance, and he's very pro-nuclear. He's a Democrat, and the Democrats are generally anti-nuclear, but he's very pro-nuclear, and he knows about all this stuff, right? So I brief him regularly, and I'm hoping he gets to be president. That would be great. But you know,
hope for the cooperation.
Yeah. I'm working with all the different countries. I'm working with Korea and Japan, and, you know, ultimately somebody's going to do this. It's just, I want it to happen fast.
I hope so. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for your lecture. It was very interesting. And I would want to ask about countries which are far from the shore. Have you got any solutions or ideas how to solve this problem?
Which problem?
About the countries which are far from the shore. Where there is no
countries
shore.
which are far from the shore. Well, you can build these modules, and you can put them on land, right? And they're small enough that you can ship them by plane. Really big plane, right? But they have cargo planes that are big enough to hold one of these modules. China is looking at doing this because China has been building coal-fired power plants for years and years. They were opening up like one per week for a long time. And so they've invested lots and lots of money into coal-fired power plants, and they want to stop using coal because of their particulate pollution, right? They realized that the temperatures that these molten salt reactors run at, they could just replace the coal burner with a module, right? And they could continue to use all the rest of the infrastructure. So they want to do this in China. They want to put them on land and keep the coal plants burning without coal.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your lecture. Talking about the climate change problem, I've been following a journalist, American journalist, Mike Schellenberger.
Oh yeah, he's a good
Environmental
friend
Progress.
Actually, I introduced Michael to advanced nuclear power.
Okay, so
I've worked with him for a long time.
Yes,
Have you seen the movie Pandora's Promise? Yeah, there's a movie called Pandora's Promise. If you can't find it on YouTube, you can email me and I'll send it to you. Michael is in that movie.
Oh, okay.
talking about it's a movie about nuclear power and all the fears that people have about it and why they don't make sense. But Michael's very good.
Yes, he's doing a lot of work to enlighten people about the scientific basis of nuclear instead of emotional, sensationalizing the issue.
Yeah.
So one of the points he makes is that the climate change issue, it has a lot of oil and gas industries, backing up the wind, so the clean energy. Yes, and so I think it's going to be very difficult to, to convince people to move over to nuclear power if you still have oil and gas, trying to make the clean energy companies, be more acceptable than nuclear. So I follow his updates weekly, but I'm thinking it's going to be difficult to if oil and gas companies are behind, the wind, solar, renewable
They are,
energies,
especially the gas companies.
Yes. So it's going to be difficult to convince people because most youths now that follow climate change propaganda, they feel the solution is not nuclear, but it's clean. It's a wind.
Right.
Yes.
So I was talking to the CEO of Southern Nuclear, which is the company that's building 2 reactors in the state of Georgia, and I was talking to him about power ships, and he said, if I could buy a power ship, he said, I would buy it in a minute. He says, do you know what a pain in the ass it is to build a nuclear power plant? He said, if I could just float one in here and plug into it, he said, I'd do it in a minute. And I've talked to other CEOs of utility companies, and they all say the same thing. They say, I'll buy the second one. If you can build power plants for $1 a watt, nuclear power plants that are safe, and you're the CEO of a utility company, you need electricity, you need to produce electricity, and you can get dependable 24-hour-a-day electricity for $1 a watt. I don't care if you've got 500 Greenpeace protesters in your parking lot, you're going to buy that reactor, right? I mean, the economics are going to drive it. And a lot of young people realize they don't have the same type of visceral fear of the word nuclear that people of my generation had because of the Cold War, right? They've been raised in a different era, and they're sharp, they're smart, right? Smart enough to realize that a lot of times they've been lied to, and people like Michael Schellenberger are educating them about this, right? But ultimately, if you get a cheap, safe reactor, it's going to happen, and the public sentiment will come along behind. Now, you might have the environmental movement in the United States might slow things down in the United States, and it slowed things down in Taiwan. But some country, very likely South Korea or Indonesia, is going to start building these, and then the utility companies in other countries are going to go, wow, we want that. And once they're operational in one country, then it would be very easy for a utility company, which utility companies have a lot of political power in the United States, and the utility companies could put pressure on the government, on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to say, hey, license this reactor, right? And it's very easy for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to license a reactor if they can just go watch one operating and get all the data from it, right? So ultimately, if the economics don't work, it doesn't matter how good the technology is, nobody's going to build it. If the economics are really attractive and the technology is good, it'll get done.
Thank you, Tom Bliss, your lecture. I have a question about recycling all types of nuclear fuel. And how many years do pyroprocessing facility pay off?
Oh, it's quite cheap. I couldn't give you the number off the top of my head, but these are
Approximately.
well, it depends on what value you give to the fuel that comes out of it, you know.
Yeah.
You know, there are companies and governments that would pay you to take the fuel, and then you would so you would take their spent fuel, they would pay you, then you would make new fuel out of it, and then you would sell that fuel and you would get paid for that. There's a guy named Ben Hurd. If you follow Michael Schellenberger, you might have heard of Ben Hurd. He's an Australian who got involved with one of the politicians, one of the senators in Australia, and the senator wanted to build the pyroprocessing plant in Australia and have South Korea pay him to take their spent fuel because they want to get rid of it, and then create new fuel that he could sell. And so they did all the economic analysis of how this would work, and they realized that, you know, this could work so well. So the senator made a proposal to the voters in his district. He said, if you approve this project to build this pyroprocessing plant, to take in this spent fuel and recycle it,
Yeah.
we'll build a reactor that would burn some of it, and we'll give you electricity for free.
Oh.
So the economics are pretty good. You can get a hold of Ben Hurd through our website if you want to talk to him about the economics of the recycling.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, one more question. I'll join my thanks with my colleagues. Thank you very much for the presentation. Now back to the floating reactor, the ship reactors. You slightly mentioned the issue of tsunami. I need you to tsunami.
Yeah.
I need you to probably elaborate, just in case there's a tsunami. And you know, it doesn't just go up; it goes right into the city.
Yeah. Well, if you anchor the ship in deep enough water offshore, then it's not a problem. A tsunami, if you're offshore, a tsunami just lifts you up a little bit. You don't even feel it, right? You don't even see it. If you're going to build it and you want to put it close to shore, or on a reef, say 20 miles offshore, a lot of places there are shallow places where you can build breakwaters. And essentially you just build a breakwater, you know, walls, seawalls, high enough, and then you got a ship floating in there, and if a tsunami comes in and the ship goes up or down, it's not a big deal. You know, so you know, we know how tsunamis work, and the Devaney's have lots of experience with big ships and how they move around. So yeah, it's a very, very workable proposition. Originally, when I suggested that they build them on the ships, they had the idea that they would float the ship in and they would ballast it and sit it on the bottom, right? And I was always maintaining that they should keep them floating. And eventually they came to the idea that they should keep them floating. So that's the idea. But if you're going to have it relatively close to the shore, you would have a breakwater that would, you know, if a tsunami came in, you would get a rise and a fall, but you wouldn't get the sideways movement.
My question is same topic, the politics impact on nuclear energy. So in the beginning of this year, I read the document which called Green New Deal. Yeah, which consists some surprising ideas like not to use airplanes and also nuclear energy. So it looks like people who does not understand how nuclear energy works used this topic for their own interests. So how is it dangerous, and how is it serious?
The Green New Deal?
I mean, in general, the politics force.
The Green New Deal was presented by a young woman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's like, she's kind of become the face of the new generation in American politics. And she was working with a senator Ed Markey, who's notoriously anti-nuclear, right? Ridiculously anti-nuclear. And she didn't understand about this. So she just put out a FAQ about, you know, her Green New Deal, which it's not even really a plan. It's just kind of some ideas, right? And in it, she said we shouldn't use any nuclear power. Well, almost immediately, other people like Senator Cory Booker said, no, this is crazy. And she took the thing down off the internet. And then some of the propaganda, the Republican propaganda organizations like Fox News, they took it and they said, oh, she's going to make you stop flying and she's going to take away your hamburgers. And, you know, it's just totally crazy. The Green New Deal is basically a lot of ideas about, you know, kind of general vision concepts for what can happen in the world. People have asked me to go talk to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez about nuclear power so that I can educate her about it. I don't know if I'll get a chance to do that, but ultimately it's kind of a tempest in a teapot. It's a propaganda thing that's happening.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Now we make set photo with our student. Photo. Okay.